So I wanted to start out this morning by hopefully not putting you back to sleep and giving you a few reflections on exposing the determinants. We've been working with the population health model that was introduced somewhere in the mid-90s, almost for 15 years now, and the determinants of health came out of the population health model that was introduced then. And this is the list. And, having worked with this for quite a long time, what I found was that you get into the determinants and lose the sense of what the whole is all about. And so I'm going to try to address some of these in the way that we've handled it through looking at it in our surveys for the last 10 years. We started our first survey around 2000. In the summer, it was a very it was a beginning that which we had no kind of experience in doing this sort of thing. As a matter of fact, I had done all qualitative research up until this moment, and except in my undergrad in political science, I'd been knocking on doors doing opinion surveys, and so it was a very long time before I picked up on doing surveys again. And so now I've had 10 years of it, and I've even been teaching survey research in university. So we've come a long way, and I've certainly honed my skills through this. Our approach to the Sex Now survey has been what we call sampling the crowd. It's not considered a scientific sample in the sense that we have a randomly achieved sample in any way, but our experience is that when we go into the crowd, we certainly see diversity and randomness in the way that people come into the survey. And you get a sense of it from there. So what we've seen in the Sex Now survey, there has been, in our experience, the expected kind of gradient in which you would predict that you would see more risk in poorer part of the population. We've never seen that. And as a matter of fact, last year, it kind of happened on the podium that we found out that our colleagues in Montreal had never seen it either. And so they've never seen it in Toronto. And we wonder really what that means. I mean, you could come to the conclusion, or you might speculate what it means, that somehow gay men form one place together in terms of the status gradient, but we don't really have a reason for it. It's just there, so something to think about. We did this last year. We asked a loneliness question, and the term was "so lonely we're starved for company." And we found that 62% felt that at times, 28% often. When we look at education, we find that gay men that come into our samples, these are sometimes 3,000 in our samples, that we find that 72% have either a college or university education, and I can tell you that about 42% of that is a university education, and yet 75% of us make under $70,000 a year. So think about that. By the way, the Canadian population as a whole has about 36% tertiary education. So we ask a question about whether you feel that your career has ever been affected. It's not really a great question because it could go either way. You could have your career negatively affected or positively affected. But 24% tell us that their career has been affected negatively. And just bring that figure up again, where 55% of us make under $50,000. This is one where a lot of gay men converge, this dissatisfaction with the physical spaces that we have access to. And in the Vancouver and BC area, very large, 71% dissatisfied with what we have. We know from collecting data for years now with the Sex Now survey that things are changing as far as social environments and gay men are concerned, and this just simply says it as charts that we've been collecting since 2002, that the internet community is rising, but gay men's participation in the physical community is slacking off. So we wonder what that means. And again, in terms of personal health practices, we see that HIV risk is rising through the survey, and also those who are untested is rising. So we're not saying here that we're seeing a great fall in the tested population. We're just seeing an expansion of men who have never tested for their HIV status. And we're seeing that particularly in the young, where we're seeing about 17% untested here. In men under 30, it's more up into the 30% untested. Last year, we collected data on unwanted sex experience prior to 18, and this is what we discovered from there, that about 30% of us had had that experience. We also collected information on those who feel oppressed by their situation, and you know, I guess maybe all of us feel this at some point. But what we generally found was that 71% say they feel oppressed at times, 30% often. We also asked in 2007 whether guys were satisfied with the efforts that were being made in terms of prevention for gay men, and we got a kind of 50-50 thing. Now, I can tell you from working in cancer that if there was 50% satisfaction with cancer services, this would be seen as an emergency. The expectation is that 85% of people would be satisfied with cancer services, and this is what we have in terms of gay men's satisfaction with our prevention services. This is one way of looking at gender, is just a distribution of what happens to people who don't fit in the gender roles that are given to us. And so we find that 50% of those end up single. And then we have the distribution otherwise of, now again, this is what comes into our samples, but we're also talking about very large samples, and we've been talking now to about 10,000 men in all of these years, and this is what we see. And, you know, from a cultural perspective, this is what we see in our samples of those who've ever been exposed to anti-gay violence, 51% of us. So when you look at this, you get the idea that really we're talking about all one thing. And we get it over and over again in this kind of way. Whatever name you want to give it, it's there. So we wonder, is this a missing determinant? Is there something about sexual orientation that's at work here? And how do we name that determinant? I'll leave it to you to think about that over the conference, about what we should name that determinant. But obviously it's not here. It's not in this list. We can say how all of these determinants affect us, but there's something that's missing. There's something very big that's missing here. And the best way to see that is with HIV and gay men. And I want to turn us back to the early 1990s, and the first director of the WHO program on HIV, Jonathan Mann, who by the 1990s was already through that role and finished it by the time that I'd come up to him. And he got us thinking that HIV was not only the disease that we were suffering, but it was just an indicator disease of what we were really suffering. And in that, we had to separate out what was the proximate cause from the root cause. The proximate cause, he says, was things like anal sex, routes of transmission, all those behaviors that people have been so fixed on in all of these years. The root cause is something social. It's the way society reacts to the proximate cause. And it was his feeling that, in terms of HIV, that it seemed to trigger draconian responses in society in which the first knee-jerk reaction was to shut down or shut out. In that, he observed that HIV followed a path of least resistance to the most marginalized. He never really talked about gay men when he talked about this, but you knew all the time that that was what he was talking about because of when he was the director of the WHO. And unfortunately, Jonathan Mann died 10 years ago in the Swiss 111 air crash, and he never really got a chance to see what his prediction would turn out to be and whether it would actually turn out to be true. It took us years later to see that that he was actually onto something. And I think, Jonathan, what you have to know, although he was a physician and an epidemiologist, and a very highly placed physician and epidemiologist, he was seen to be somewhat of a crank by the rest of his profession, the ideas that he was exposing us to. And yet this is what he saw was our pinch points. All of these places where decisions are made about gay men are the places where we as a collective suffer from the decisions that people make. And we saw this in our first summit, and I've just put some things here to you. Here's Mark talking about one way to conceive of that social determinant that's missing. And Chris Buckner, who was then head of the HIV program in the Vancouver region, saying, well, yes, indeed, we have to admit that gay men are the most involved in this and have the least resources to deal with it. So come ahead to this year with the publication of Elizabeth Pisani's book, The Wisdom of Whores. She was here at the Canadian AIDS Conference in April, presenting to Canada's researchers on HIV, and I don't think that she even understood at all what was happening in Canada to gay men. The kind of impression that you would get from Carr would simply not bring out the things that I'm bringing out today. And she essentially is saying some of the same things that Jonathan Mann was saying. And she's given us a huge exposure to what's happened all over the world, that through one way or another, that the people who need the resources and the services for HIV most, much as Jonathan Mann said, we're not getting it because of the decision panels and so on. And we also have in this year a fellow colleague, a gay colleague in Australia, Gary Dowsett, who's been doing some writing on this. He's concerned about the adequacy of homophobia for explaining all of this, and writes the idea, a sociological idea of moral panic may be what we're really dealing with here. And he calls it, in terms of dealing with homosexuals, that the moral panic is a severe compulsion to want to defend heterosexuality when you see gay men being happy. And he certainly has been around the HIV world enough, following Elizabeth around, to know that this is going on worldwide. Now, I wanted to put this in front of you too, because here we see Judith Auerbach saying something slightly different. She's looking at how these determinants may eventually affect individual behavior. It's one way to think. It's often our knee-jerk reaction to think of how does all this social stuff affect individual behavior. But remember that on the population level, we're talking about the collective impact of decisions that people make. And then we go to probably the most supreme gay scholar of all time, Michel Foucault, who was the head of the Académie Française, for some sort of understanding about this, about sexuality. In his history of sexuality, he points out that it hasn't always been this way, that in Greek society, that sexuality was looked at something like a diet, that, you know, there were lots of things in it. And that really, like a diet, most of our ethical concerns was having too much or too little of it. So I want to pose this to you after looking at these and reflecting on these. When we go to do our next survey, when we think about what we're dealing with in this conference, it's one simple question. Are we asking the right questions? Are we getting down to how the determinants are really affecting us? Thank you, and have a great conference.